Well, I've just I'm back now, a week and a half back from Ireland, so I'm finally over the jet lag. I think I've finally caught up my work, and yeah, I'm pretty satisfied at the moment, pretty happy. I suppose one thing I've done is in the last while, I think related to that I've sort of intensified my efforts with my practice. But in the last several months, for all that intensification, to be honest with you, there's been a very much a boredom factor just kicking in, and also a loneliness, strangely, that I've felt at times a little like a closeted homosexual in a religious fundamentalist society, in that there is simply no way you can talk about what you're interested in with the people around you, like the topics of this conversation. And ultimately, what I was finding is that this has given rise to some very real despair that I thought I could resolve by simply doubling down on the program again and again. But that failed, I would have to say. So as a result, what I've done is I approached my old Gurdjieff group, and I've rejoined simply in order to have my company and also a certain stimulus. It's interesting, today I caught up with, I have an old friend, he's involved, and I met a new member I didn't know previously, and it was just interesting to be able to spend a few hours in the real world, in real time, actually being able to speak in an honest and candid manner. And it sort of reinforced to me something I had started to observe about myself, is that at any one time I've been like operating like a computer with two operating systems. I have a sort of a personality I sort of deploy to interact with the world, and then alongside that is what I really think and feel, to the extent I can make that distinction. And I just honestly found that company today healthy for me, sort of nourishing in some way, just to be able to just to speak my mind rather than put on a facade.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I can certainly see where you're coming from. I think a lot of otherwise intelligent people tend to underestimate the extent to which experience has to be shared. There are plenty of times when I've been in maybe parallel situations or parallel circumstances where I've expressed just a basic desire to share an experience or to be able to speak to people who are like-minded. And you hear that sort of thing shot down as if it's a kind of pathetic, unnecessary need, but I think it's fundamental. I think a lot of
Yeah,
experience has to be shared by definition, and if it's not, it just doesn't work.
absolutely. Even, I mean, I've noticed in my own thinking about this and how I relate to others, to honestly even just use that word, to just say it, to be honest, and say, well, I feel lonely. I noticed that is a change for me. That's something. There are words I don't think I've ever used, um, but it is the truth of the matter. And with an insistence on meditation, you begin to, you can be alive to maybe the dangers inherent in wholly isolating yourself from much social interaction in order to, create that space, time and space to carry out those exercises. But at the same time, that social interaction where it's, healthy, as the top I enjoy today, it brings you more alive. Strangely, it's by virtue of the fact that your life is seen by another human being, it makes it more vital. And I'm a little disappointed in myself that it's taken me almost 37 years to sort of come to that kind of basic insight.
Well, I know how that goes too, but there's no speeding up the process, I guess. Time flows at its own speed. You can't speed it up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, even today, the person I met with, he's in his I assume his early 20s, and I was just surprised at how far along he is at that age. And when I think back to my own self at that time, um, it's with I sort of look it through the fingers of my hand, that kind of way. But yeah, you bring to life a certain pattern, and you have to work with it.
Yeah, I think probably the majority, if not all, of human experiences is only real to the extent that it is shared. And I can only keep saying that, I've run into similar situations where I've said things similar to what you have just said, and you get the response from people that, suck it up. But that's not correct. The foundation has to be there for the experience. It is social. That's all there is to it. Human life is social first. And maybe after a foundation is laid where, and accept that it's social, that you're not alone in some really fundamental sense, then you can be alone. There's a difference between being alone and lonely. I mean, of course you can survive being alone if in your mind all sorts of unstated and unknown conditions are satisfied. But to be fundamentally lonely is an experience that really most people never even encounter. And so they're coarse when presented with it because they have no experience with it and therefore no sympathy.
Right. Yeah. It's good insight. And speaking of sympathy, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to just turn the conversation to your Buddhist friend, but if you wanted to say more on that topic of solitude and loneliness.
Well, I've experienced in my mind something that matches the words that you've used, the expressions you've used, exactly. That's not to say that I know exactly how you feel because the circumstances are not the same, but I mean, time and again, I've experienced a kind of excruciating loneliness on account of seeing things a certain way, seeing many things a certain way, and realizing that it's simply not shared. And there are good, legitimate reasons for this. I mean, I think you go through childhood, you go to school, it's a social occasion. Your learning is social. Your learning takes place in front of other children, in front of a teacher. You're praised for knowing things. You're scolded for not knowing things. Most of you are raised to assume, and maybe rightfully so, that experience is shared. And if you want to go so far, you can say that, for an experience to be real, it has to be shared. There's something more, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. A shared experience is somehow more than simply an experience that is contained, quote unquote, in two different people, if you ask me. And the same thing goes with insights. If you develop insights into your world, I think there's an automatic tendency, all things being equal, to want to share it. The expectation is there that it can be shared. In fact, you might even say the insight is formed only insofar as in the mind there is some sort of scenario of sharing built in, however obscure the origins of that scenario. I mean, why bother thinking of anything at all if that thought is not already directed to some other? So I experienced that for years. I mean, everything I would think of, things I would write and so on, I kept expecting there would be this context of sharing, and it was often never there. And you feel completely alone and lonely, to be more precise, and yet it's the kind of thing that has no place in today's social dialogue. It's kind of something that doesn't exist within the episteme, so to speak. You can't really get people to understand that sort of thing, so you suffer in silence.
Oh, sure. And I think then there's something more to that, in that there is a second order effect arises, I think, when your thinking is so isolated and unexpressed. I think, for want of its manifestation, it almost turns toxic. So what I noticed in my personality, in that sort of everyday person I am on the street, in the workplace, is a real cynicism has sort of established itself. And I would imagine some people who would know me would probably consider me to be quite, flip or glib, or trite even. And I'm not saying that that's an unfair observation, but I think it just arises when you continue at a process of being unable to actually express your thinking. So organically, I feel there's almost a hatred builds up, a malice within you towards this world that will not, if you like, accept you. And so that manifests itself in that just particular edge. I'd find it in my interactions, which notably, to me at least, was wholly absent as in my dealings today. I could be,
Yeah.
sincere and forthright, and I wasn't at all ever reached for for a mocking quip or sarcastic remark. It was, I could engage in a healthy conversation.
Well, I know exactly what you mean about the poison. I find that my ongoing experience of the world for many, many years has been one in which I find everything I say, if I attempt to actually convey something, is misunderstood, to the extent where for years I had nightmares about trying to explain something to somebody and having it completely misunderstood. So, for example, in some scenario, this doesn't match a particular dream, but it's a kind of general template. There might be some really obvious disaster on the horizon. Godzilla might be standing right behind you, and you're in front of 3 or 4 or 5 people, and you say, we got to get out of here and look, there's Godzilla. And they just misunderstand what you say and, take no fucking interest in it. And this was like a recurring nightmare for years. But then in the everyday state, regarding the poison, I feel I know exactly what you mean, because that kind of suffering, it has nowhere to go. In my own case, I'm aware of it. It has only 2 directions it can go. It can either go out against the world or in against yourself. And if you're aware that it exists, you make sure that it doesn't go in either direction. It doesn't go out toward the world, against the world, and it isn't directed against yourself. But if you're careful and you prevent that from happening, either case happening, it still just sits there. So you've got this pool of poison just sitting there. That's how it is with me in any case.
Yeah, and I smiled when I read of your experiences with that particular blog. My favorite spiritual reading online is The Fix magazine. And The Fix is an online journal dedicated to the subject of addiction and recovery from addiction. And I find there more wisdom and insight than in any other webpage, because that subject of addiction to, of course, like alcohol, but even the harder substances, involves very real life and death struggle in consciousness itself. So in an exaggerated fashion, in a very dramatic fashion, some of the key observations about the human condition made in various wisdom traditions are drawn out, and the effort of liberation is played out in the face of these various dependencies. Recently, there's been, in this field, there's been much play made of a book published by Johan Hari about the last days of the war on drugs. And what he's talking about, what he describes, is that the war on drugs, the effort of states to stamp out production and consumption through legal means is ending. Many countries have seen its failure. Some countries have had the courage to act to legalize all forms of drugs, decriminalize them at least. So he gives the example of Portugal. And in his book, he talks about why that war on drugs has failed. And he speaks about the role of a certain series of experiments that were made in the 1960s, I believe, where they were an effort was made to understand the nature of addiction. So got rats, put them in a cage, two water bottles, and one is pure water, the other is water laced with some drug. In time, again, they noticed that the rats would experiment, try both bottles, finally begin to choose the laced water, and then develop a dependency on that laced water. So then the understanding was that the origin of addiction is with the substance. However, some researchers noted the problem with this idea. For instance, they noted that people who spend time in hospitals on large amounts of morphine, which is essentially heroin, are able to leave hospital and quit morphine use with ease. He also then talks about the fact that in the huge numbers of American servicemen that acquired a heroin habit in Vietnam, which they were very capable of kicking once they returned home. And so one researcher observed the problem with the initial experiment was that you put a single rat, you isolate him and you put him in a cage. So he decided to build what he called Rat Park. So rather than just one rat in a cage with the two warders, he had put a rat in a cage with lots of stimulation, lots of girl rats, lots of food, variation in his environment. In other words, a rat utopia. And what he noticed in this instance is that the rats would typically shun the laced water. So what he argued was that the addiction and the chemical use is driven by the environmental conditions, and primarily by the isolation, the lack of relation, the lack of communion, the lack of any meaningful interaction. And if you treat, and he said you just place that onto then the what we're speaking about is this problem where you just can't actually relate to your world around you, Well, for me, that explains that old perennial or, regular desire to just get myself wiped with alcohol. And that's exactly it. It's one way of, you're the rat in the cage, and you just think, well, fuck it. I'm suffering. I can barely handle this shit. I'm sick of living in a fucking world where the most obvious things aren't seen by the people around me.
Well, I'm glad you explained that and mentioned that scientific work because, it corresponds exactly to what I've already been thinking. I mean, I can say with considerable pride, I've been binge drinking every third day, probably for about 4 years. And the reasons are obvious. Now, I go online, I make a lot of obscene comments, I try to enjoy myself when I'm drunk, but it's always the same pattern, and people who are aware of the pattern, some of them come to me with a kind of cartoonish idea of alcoholism. They say you have a drinking problem. And I've said in the past, I don't have a drinking problem, I have a life problem. If my life were better, I wouldn't drink. Are you fucking kidding me? I mean, if you're in a room with zero human contact year after year, and you really have nothing else to do, that's what you will do.
Right.
There's a certain amount of logic to it. I mean,
and that's exactly what Hari he pointed out. The American servicemen were leaving the hell of Vietnam. They were going home. People leave hospital to go home. And he said the answer to addiction is relationship. And this is what they found in Portugal. The Portuguese were the first to decriminalize it. And they found with heroin addicts that the simple key was to build relationships into their life. So to encourage them to set up businesses together. And they all help each other then. They've meaning, some reason to get out of bed in the morning, care for each other. And it's been a screaming success. Eden Hari reports something which is very dear to my heart. It's when somebody has just the sheer fucking decency to admit when they got something wrong. And that is their top cop, or one of the leading cop in when they made the change in 2000. He stood there screaming up and down, decriminalization will be a catastrophe. And he said flat out, I was wrong. It wasn't. It was a great success. Because the fundamental insights which drove the moves towards decriminalization were accurate. And it moves away from this sort of, puritanical view of addiction, that it's some sort of shameful personal failing, and rather to point out the truth of it is, which it is, it's a social failure. It's a social failure. And that makes an awful lot of sense to me in my life. Like, I note that my relation to alcohol, it's driven as a way of dealing with tension. I find is that there are times when just huge amounts of tension build up, and then I drink, and I also notice sometimes if I'm just sober for a while, I came back there for about 2 weeks, I had nothing to drink, but the tension just became almost unbearable. Now I sat down just to paint a picture here of what I was doing. I bought myself 6 cans of Heineken, thinking this will do it, So 3 liters of beer late at night, this should do it. I drank 4, and I wasn't in the least bit feeling drunk, and now I actually panicked a little, thinking I'm going to be finished my stock here and I won't be drunk, and that's a real problem. So of course I go out and buy more, I stock up, and then I wake up the next day and you actually do an audit. It's just a staggering amount of beer I put away. But why do that? Because it works. It works at the time. I feel better. The tension dissolved. Now what do? I just fucking listen to music, blah blah blah. Just as complete, like mindless, and literally mindless activity. But nonetheless, you even as any observer of the human condition, you have to look at yourself and you wonder for yourself. But the I'm just coming into a very clear recognition of where that tension's coming from. I mean, with my job, I'm fucking bored to tears. I'm so bored, just bored, and I'm just, I've also had it just with this, script I have to constantly live by. I have to say certain shit and do certain things. I don't believe any of it. And in terms of tension, it was so bad. On that day, I had gotten into I wouldn't say a heated argument, because it takes two people to argue. Let me put it this way: I got heated in the midst of a discussion, and we were talking about American foreign policy, and of course, Australia would be one of the most rabidly pro-American places on earth, outside of, I suppose, what the Republican suburbs of Southern American cities. America is our Valhalla and Utopia and Shangri-La all rolled into one. And so we're talking about Putin and Russia and the whole jazz with the plane shut down. Somebody made some throwaway remark about Putin and photos and how they doctored them. Of course, I blew up. I blew up at this, and I said, how fucking dumb are you? Let's fucking think about this. I drew an analogy. If you've like 13 boys in a fight, 12 boys versus one, you pull them apart. You ask the one boy, what happened? He says, they started on me. They kicked off, they had to go at me. Then you go to the 12 boys and say, what the fuck happened? And they say, oh, he kicked it off. He started on us, all of us simultaneously. Using your head, who the fuck are you going to believe? So this is the whole model of Russian aggression against the West. Are you fucking kidding me? Does this make any sense on any level?
Well, on the point of sympathy, it's amazing to me when you really start to look at it, just how little sympathy there is between human beings on a day-to-day basis. There's considerably less than we think. And I'm not just talking about good deeds done because logically we know that this other person has feelings too and so on. I'm talking about actually feeling for somebody at the same time they're feeling, and understanding their point of view from a place of feeling. There's very, very little of that. And this is at the heart of everything we've been talking about. When it comes to everyday human interaction, I've tried to make the point before, but I really think it's not an overstatement to say that the basic mode of human interaction day to day is war. Even if there's no overt violence, it always comes down to a kind of cold, brutal standoffishness, which is eased only in a calculated fashion. The sheer fact that so much of human interaction is calculated. You can say this to somebody, and you can't say that, and she can say this to you or feel this way toward you, and it's all calculated. Where does that need to calculate thoughts and feelings even come from? The fact that there's any kind of deep level cognitive calculation at all, where does it come from? It comes from really the lack of fellow feeling. Something we take for granted as existing, and yet really it doesn't exist in most people at all, unless it occurs here and there under defined and controlled certain, social conditions. So-and-so realizes that at this moment it's called for him or for her to feel this or that for somebody else. It's all this kind of connived orchestration. Where is the real, natural, organically formed sympathy for someone else's situation? There's very little of it. And you can see this as a major defect, a major limitation in human beings. For as much emotion as we all have individually, we have very little shared emotion, joint emotion. We confuse the fact that we're very emotional in general, and even take the fact that we're violent and irrational to confirm this, but we confuse the fact that we're emotional in general with the idea, emotional in general individually, with the idea that we're emotionally connected collectively, and we're not. People are really badly atomistic. You see this at all levels, and it relates, again, to everything we've just been discussing. And
Yeah.
I experience it constantly. I mean, you talk to people, and repeatedly, it's the experience of wanting to say to a person, you know, the old saw. They say, "Don't bite my finger. Look where I'm pointing." You know, the idea is that you are obviously trying to get at something. You're trying to convey something, but at a given moment in a given situation, there are only so many words you can say. So you're hinting at it. You're asking them to understand what you're saying based on the feelings that are obviously behind it. And people are terribly deficient in that regard. They prefer to hear only the words that you're saying in order to avoid the anxiety caused by having to entertain that feeling. People are too ill-equipped to feel the emotions of another person as their own in a given moment. So it's a mess all around, and there's a lot that could be said about it. I'll say, maybe in passing, maybe as a point of departure for more discussion, that an idea that occurred to me many, many weeks ago, and I'm sure you'll think this is a ridiculous detour, but something that occurred to me several weeks ago that I have been thinking about is that this is precisely the reason for the work of Strieber. Of course, every conversation has to come back to Strieber. But consider, you could interpret Strieber's whole work in this light. You think about it. He writes the bestseller Communion. He writes some weaker and weaker follow-up books. And a big reason why the follow-up books failed is because he was unable to produce physical evidence, direct physical proof of his contact, the contact in Communion. That's what everybody expected. That's kind of what they demanded. Here's Communion. You say, here are these elusive encounters. They've happened just now. You put the book out there, and then they're like, okay, let's have it. You know, these fuckers better show up. That was the expectation. That was what should happen next in the minds of millions. It didn't happen. And the best he could do in the end was come out with this book, Confirmation, which supposedly had the hard evidence, which was itself minor and tangential. It was not the evidence that people expected. So then what do you have after that? And for the whole rest of Strieber's career, you have a guy who, based on his earnestness alone, his constant kind of pleading, that's all he's got. That is the grounds ultimately for accepting that he's not a liar, a hoaxer, a delusionary. Now think about that, because that may itself be what it's all about. It's in plain sight. If you think of humans collectively, as a species, as a collective species, I mean, we think about different types of birds, and we have no problem thinking of them, about how they behave collectively. You see a flock of geese, and they're traveling in anticipation of the winter time. The way they coordinate their movements, we have no trouble thinking of them as basically a collective. Human beings, though, it's hard for us to conceptualize it because we're in the middle of being one. But suppose that it's true that these aliens come and they are constantly preoccupied with how we are destroying the planet. They tell us that, you know, it's our job to fix it. It's not their job. It's our job to save ourselves. Maybe they are really concerned with the way that we transmit information to one another. Maybe they're really concerned with the way that transmission of information adds up to how we behave collectively. And maybe it's obvious to them that the way that we behave collectively, the way that we are able to operate in any collective capacity, is deficient in comparison to these crises that are occurring and are coming. Well, what would you do? You would try to strengthen what's weak. You would try to improve what's there in order to mitigate this deficiency. Now, what is missing in people? The fact that they're not able to simply feel. Their emotional sense is so weak, and it's so mediated by social convention and calculation and their own basic alienation from themselves and from the world. We've discussed that previously. But the sheer fact that we cannot immediately feel what somebody else is feeling and know whether someone's telling the truth or not is a horrible limitation if we have to act collectively in any kind of real way to survive, for example. So what do? You have this one lone figure Strieber who, on the basis of his tone of voice, his honesty alone, is credible. And so you see people line up on separate sides of the issue. Most people are not moved. But those who are sensitive enough to hear that he's clearly trying to be honest are moved. So maybe this is somehow a push, whether it's successful, I'm not saying, and I'm not saying it's the only push. I'm not trying to overstate its importance, but you can see that may be why they try to strategically act using Strieber in that way, because what human beings need is a lot more, fellow feeling, if they're able to coordinate themselves at all. And that's what's lacking in people at the present time.
Well, that brings to mind, there was, I think, a remark in the Disclosure Project, I think it was Monsignor Crudo Balducci, he was with the Vatican in some senior position, and he did speak to Greer. He was interviewed by Greer, and at length he spoke about the Church's implicit acceptance of life on other worlds, that the knowledge that the Vatican itself, including the Pope, was aware of the intelligent life in other worlds. And it does come up. He says something interesting just on those points he raised. He said that if you are actually to reject the idea of the presence of extraterrestrial intelligences, you have to posit a monstrous world where you've had so many people lie. And I can't quite recall the point, but he said, in that instance, something like the Gospels would be impossible. Because how could we trust any human testimony if we are to reject the sheer mass of testimony that has been brought forward already on the narrow topic of extraterrestrial intelligence?
Well, there you go. There's considerable violence done to abductees, to witnesses, to people who are simply speaking the truth about something, and they're shut down. Society shuts down around them. The media ridicules them. Everyone is aligned against them. It's violence. It's the only way to regard it. And it's the same thing in all of these cases. The skeptics movement, which is sort of an internet phenomenon these days. These people who are willing to dismiss all witness testimony, and even go so far as to say, which they have, that the testimony of airline pilots is no better than that of ordinary people, that there's no such thing as a trained observer, and so on. It's beautiful how well this dovetails with their own basic disdain for ordinary people. One reinforces the other. They believe that Bigfoot, UFOs, all these things are all delusions. Therefore, the ordinary people who are out there walking around are prone to spontaneous delusions. It's like if a cosmic ray went through a computer and the calculations all went wrong. They think ordinary people, ordinary human beings, on a fairly regular basis, are prone to hallucinations. That's really what they think. And so, as a result, they have no respect really for the value of human beings, ordinary people, Naturally, they set themselves apart unconsciously, so they have value for themselves. But look at the violence done there. It's the same type of thing. The denigration of human beings, the willing to ascribe to them these capacities for spontaneous, unprovoked hallucinations worldwide, across populations, across history, incidentally, without really describing any mechanism, right? These are people who are supposedly science-minded, science zealots, always demanding the mechanism. You know, if you can't demonstrate the mechanism for the quantum retention of information, then there is no afterlife. You hear them saying this. Where's the mechanism? All right, well, where's the mechanism for mass hysteria? If you're going to say that a UFO sighting in a given place is really just mass hysteria, really? Describe the mechanism. I want to know how you can recreate mass hysteria. Tell me the conditions. We'll go to a small town surreptitiously, maybe in the middle of Spain, and we'll create mass hysteria. Well, that doesn't happen. And then we put that aside. It's a form of violence. I agree with you entirely. And violence is really nothing more than an incident within a general environment of war. So human beings continue to regard themselves in a war setting. It's a setting of threat and danger, confrontation. It's a standoff. Sure, they have learned to, avoid physical violence in a lot of cases, but the basic mode of interrelation is the same, it seems to me.
Oh, and I mean, and I would say that condition is intensifying. There is more such violence. There's more fighting, and there's more alongside that. There's more fucking. So you have one thing that's blisteringly obvious is the sheer sexualization of a mainstream media. The stories which sort of bleed through into what were once staid broadsheets is, I would imagine, arrestingly shocking to a reader of 20, 30 years ago. But as with such social changes and cultural changes, because they're incremental, the magnitude of the change is not really noticed. But I wonder, is there a particular mechanism at play where we have issues with overpopulation, resource exhaustion, environmental degradation are occurring at pace? But to that, there's widespread knowledge of these conditions. And there's widespread knowledge that these conditions are getting worse and that there is no meaningful response from society. So I would wonder, has subconsciously, collectively, has the idea taken hold that an extinction approaches, which then gives rise to, like so many rats in a cage, to more fighting and to more fucking?
Well, absolutely. I think this has come up in one of our conversations before, but I see it that way as well. I mean, the ship is sinking. What do the rats do? Fight and fuck. Everything is ratcheted up. That's precisely how it is. I wanted to double back real quick, though, to something, because I feel like I didn't express it well enough about this idea of sympathy and feeling for other people. Just very briefly, by way of anecdote, I have, I guess you'd call her a friend, beautiful woman from the Ukraine who just turned 40. I've known her for a couple of years. And these days we stay in contact by Facebook instant message. And she told me several days ago that she had these symptoms, sore throat, fatigue, and all these sorts of things. And I said to her, sounds like strep throat. And she ended up getting a diagnosis, and it was strep throat, so on and so forth. But anyway, she is an active person, energetic, good-natured, has a lot of ideas about healthy living and so on. And for her, coming down with this non-life-threatening illness was nevertheless kind of almost like a personal defeat, an injury of some kind. It really made her unhappy and bothered her. I wouldn't say that she understands herself in those terms. So even though she was expressing to me how she felt about getting this strep throat, and I could discern how she felt based on who she was, it wasn't something that she was conceptualizing at the same time, if you know what I mean. I said to her at one point, when she said she was sick, I said, "Oh, I feel for you." And her instant response had to be, "Oh, well, it's nothing, blah, blah, blah." So you see, the problem with the exchange was that under ordinary social conditions, it was not possible for me to say to her, "Oh, I feel for you," to really feel bad for the fact that she had gotten strep throat, given who she was. The best you could do under the prescribed social formula would be, "Oh, strep throat, oh, I hope you feel better," because it's a mild illness, right? There are rules to all of this. But you see, I felt for her for reasons that didn't belong to the social calculation, because I could see it had like a personal significance for her. All I could say was, "Oh, I feel for you." And she immediately observed that I was feeling more for her than the conditions allowed. So her prescribed social response was to write back and say, "Oh, well, it's nothing. I'll be better in a couple of days, blah, blah, blah." So here's a conversation, a communication that could not take place. I mean, in a way, under no circumstances can you come out and say, "Oh, well, I really feel for you because I understand that you're this type of person based on your, makeup and so on." So if you do the more decent feeling thing and simply express the feeling, that's also impermissible. You can't do that either. So you see, you can't actually authentically feel when you're not allowed to. This is the kind of example of what I'm getting at. And this also ties all the way back to what we were talking about, the feeling of loneliness. Because if you end up personally in a situation where your social calculation about everything is skewed, maybe because you have learned things about the world, you've got a different worldview, you've had different experiences that really take you outside of the norm, you will find that nothing really works. Nothing really works in your social communication. You can't convey your feelings to people at all because you are conscious of the social calculation that they are only minimally conscious of. You experience it as a kind of obstacle, as a kind of game in the worst sense, and you've been cast out. The natural give and take between you and the rest of humanity is now impossible. And incidentally, this also gets back to that little paper on dukkha, if that's pronounced even vaguely right, because that's the same type of thing that I was trying to get at. The idea that you have these combinations that you have to work, and that given the nature of time and space itself, that humans' social reality is a combinatory type of game that our brains are negotiating for us. And when things line up right, then there's this eruption of feeling that only under prescribed circumstances, right? And when it doesn't line up, then there's no feeling, so on and so on and so on. It all kind of ties together, it seems to me.
The first thing I would say about Buddhism and the historic Buddha is that the very sutra were not written until hundreds of years after his death. Actual records are based on the oral teachings handed down, I'm quite sure it was centuries after his death. As a result, they're somewhat questionable. The issue of dukkha, as I've understood it, suffering, arises from desire for conditions, objects, emotional states, whatever. Unfortunately, given the nature of this physical world, mental and emotional worlds, that desire can never be satisfied. As a result, we then live in this condition of dukkha. The Buddha's teaching was to end dukkha, to end suffering. And how this was done, of course, is by letting go of desire. Now, I understand that from what you wrote and in your engagement with the Buddhist blog, is you're making reference, you're trying to approach what were original meanings. My understanding, and it is limited, I have to insist it's limited, I've had a passing interest in Buddhism, is that the teachings themselves are not simply reified generation on generation. They're realized regularly by the upholders of the various lineages. And this mechanism, if you like, this conditions, these relations between desire, desiring, suffering, and the cessation of suffering is fully experienced in the life and in the round of these realizers, these people within the lineage. Now, the reason I mention this is that I'm just would wonder about your own approach to the theory as you discover it within the various sutra and the text and the Pali Canon and the like that you've looked at. Because by my, albeit limited understanding, that stands a second place to the discovery of certain truths, so it's claimed, within the lives and the actual teaching as it exists today.
Well, as a preliminary note, I've only come to look at Buddhism recently on account of the fact that not long before that, I've been looking at early Christianity. You know, prehistory, antiquity, it's all sort of fascinating if you come to the point where mysteries are fascinating to begin with. The fact, and you gain some sense of what history and historiography are really like. Then, in a sense, it's a mental exercise to try to entertain the possibilities, what might have been the case, what might not have been the case, at the same time that you're trying to come to grips with a lot of assumptions that you've made yourself about events in history, the nature of history itself, so on and so forth. So it's a problem in every direction, a puzzle in every direction. When you're looking at the origins of Christianity, that's certainly the case. Moving to Buddhism, it's certainly come up in conversation many times over the course of the years. Obviously, to the extent that we talk about meditation, Buddhism ends up being referred to. And I've always had a lot of personal resistance to it. And I wouldn't say that this is simply some sort of emotional aversion. The fact is that you can have instincts that are also based in reason, conceptual instincts, so to speak. You can have a sense of something in your mind. That doesn't mean that you can instantly write a thesis on it. But if you took the time and unpacked it over months and months, you might find that very sense in your mind was just as sophisticated and as nuanced as the thesis you eventually unpacked. So I would say I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about Buddhism without necessarily being able to instantly unroll them, like pull them down to my sleeve
Sure.
and give them in a laundry list. But because it's come up so often, on the one hand, and on the other hand, because of the fact that I discovered that there was in fact a lot more communication between the Near East in antiquity and India than is usually understood. This really struck me as interesting. I mean, you can go to Wikipedia and look up an article called Greco-Buddhism. And I stumbled across that maybe a month ago or so and was amazed, bowled over by the fact that these orange robes that you see Buddhist monks wearing today are really Greek togas. This is what it says in any event.
Sure.
Now, I think people of a primitive mind would just take that as a detail and dismiss its importance. But to me, that kind of detail instantly signals a massive cross-communication and contamination. When an article of clothing, a particular style of garment, becomes basically the garment and is worn even to this day, this thing that the Buddhist monks wear, when you find out that it is a Greek toga, you're going to tell me that they were totally separate, distinct domains and they really had no contact? No, it's bullshit. If they had contact on that point, then they had contact on 100 or 1,000 other points of which we are unaware. When it comes to the origins of Greek philosophy, it's the same. When you learn that the Pythagoreans were vegetarians and ascetics and so on, when you go back and you look at what remains of Parmenides, when you learn that there were notable Greek philosophers who accompanied Alexander the Great to India and then came back and basically recreated Buddhist doctrines as they encountered them in new form, to me, there is now no basis for distinction. I don't see Western civilization, Western cultural civilization, as a meaningful term anymore. To me, you might as well just call it Indo-European and include Buddhism and its predecessors
Sure.
with the Greeks and so on, because it's a continuum.
I was just thinking you could almost use the term Aryan civilization, but
No, absolutely.
So-
And they do, of course, in quiet academic journals, they still will have recourse to that term. But you're right. You certainly could.
I'd say, what I'd add to that is that there is that linkage between ancient Egypt and Greece that is borne out not least by the surviving biographical facts of large numbers of notable Greeks who did go to Egypt for learning and training. And alongside that, I would add my own experience in a Buddhist monastery here in Australia, where some of the lay community took it upon themselves to explore the remnants or explore the artifacts of ancient Egypt for parallels with the Theravada tradition. And they put on this mighty little display showing of links and parallels between both, which forcefully, to me at least, indicated that while the thought is that you have quite distinct religious and spiritual forms, what was more likely is that there was great commonalities between the religion as practiced in ancient Egypt and that religious culture which took hold in the jungles of Southeast Asia.
Well, I wouldn't dispute it. And as far as the Buddhist-Egyptian connection goes, another shocking thing to discover is that Buddhist missionaries were sent out all over southern Europe and northern Africa and the Near East, and that in Alexandria, Egypt, there was a Buddhist monastery. The timing of the dating escapes me, but it's something anywhere between 100 to 200 BC to 100 to 200 AD. I mean, there were Buddhists living in groups in Alexandria, Egypt. That's extremely significant given that so much of Christianity's historical origin seemed to come out of Alexandria. There are people who point out that a lot of the superstructure of Christianity, the social divisions, the fact you have monks and nuns and so on, that did not come out of Judaism. And it's been kind of absurdly, naively assumed that it's a spontaneous development. But when you understand that these things don't come out of nowhere, they usually come out of some other pre-existing social milieu, you ask, well, what milieu was it? That you've got the idea of disciples, and then you've got the idea of missionaries and so on. And this wasn't Judaism. Well, you find a lot of what is now understood to be Christianity coming potentially out of Buddhism. You look at the Gospel of Thomas, and again, I mean, people have pointed out that these read like Zen koans, a lot of the so-called sayings of Jesus. But the overall project in the Gospel of Thomas, you could regard as something very sympathetic to Buddhism. So in any case, you've got all of this to be taken into account, and it was only with that being taken into account and entertained that I had a kind of interest at that point in looking at Buddhism. And doing so, I was interested more in the origins because, to my mind, the later developments are not as authentic. Now, sure, you can make the case, and I'm sure Buddhists do, something similar to what you mentioned earlier, where these experiences are discovered and rediscovered, and the validation is an ongoing process. But you could equally put all of that aside and say, well, this is the story naturally that Buddhists tell to themselves. Obviously, when it comes to Christianity and the Catholic Church, you can say, oh, well, look, I mean, this doctrine that you accept as true, Doctrine X, was developed by this theologian in the year 400. And they'll say, oh, yeah, but even so, it's been confirmed by experience in the sense that it was caused by the Holy Spirit that this theologian would produce the work and so on. So the religions are self-sealing in some sense. I'm not saying that's absolutely true and that there's zero authentic experience being obtained. I'm just saying you can bracket the claim made by the Buddhists themselves that, these later developments are of equal or even more importance, can be bracketed and put aside at least temporarily. So you can continue with your interest in the origins. And I also have come across the same type of problem with the historical Buddha that you find with the historical Jesus. A lot of the same objections can be made. A lot of the same wishful thinking is evident in the work of scholars who say, well, we all agree and know that there was a historical Buddha. But then others will kind of concede on the side that, well, if we're being scientific, strictly speaking, there's no positive evidence for a historical Buddha, but nonetheless, so you run into that problem. But as we've discussed before, to my mind, one of the problems that has to exist with Buddhism is one that exists with every tradition, and that is there's a lot of linguistic slippage over the generations. There's a lot of bad translation. When you look at what exists in English from Buddhism, to my mind anyway, it's shockingly bad because it conveys nothing. The problem as I see it is that because it's a kind of quasi-religion, it's a set of traditionally transmitted practices, and there is a kind of authoritarianism in Buddhism from my perspective. This is simply overlooked. If something is translated from one text to another badly, to the point where a sort of intellectually meaningful content is lost, and then the original text is lost, and then this mantra is repeated across the generations, it ends up being incumbent on you to simply accept that there's this meaning behind it that you don't immediately see, but that's because you're ignorant and you need to overcome your ignorance, as in fact it might well be a bad translation. So looking at the linguistic evidence, looking at the historical evidence, is necessary to find out what really might have been there. And that's not to say that, I don't want to overemphasize it and say that everything at the origin is automatically pure and authentic. I'm not. It's a question of degree. For example, if there was no historical Buddha at all, then uncovering the texts from 200 years after his death in pristine condition will certainly bring you no closer to any authentic experience that was had by the historical Buddha, because there was none. So you see what I mean? The point is not some holy grail of authenticity. The point is simply to minimize error as much as possible. That's kind of where I've been coming from. Well, there's good work on exactly that point on this blog. Maybe it's a convenient time to mention it. This particular blog of this fellow who goes by the name of Yaya Rava, something along those lines, has a blog, which I discovered only a few days ago. And there are many very high quality pieces on the blog that try to do exactly what I have sort of wanted to see done. He very critically examines the existing texts. He uses textual evidence to trying to really nail down this or that understanding of a word, a phrase, translations. And he finds, in the case of this latest text, the so-called Heart Sutra, that more than likely this formula, quote, form is emptiness, end quote, that's been bandied about now in the English language for generations, is a kind of barely sensical corruption of something that was much more reasonable and clear in the earlier stages. So, of course, the guy turns out to be a twat, but what can you do? The work, nevertheless, such as it is, I think is a big help. At least in Western philosophy, and particularly in the French postmodern philosophy, with its attentiveness to language, which he poo-poos, and that's a side point, something entertaining we can discuss in passing. This attention to language has been around now for a couple of generations. These guys, in their own philosophical struggle with each other and themselves, they have been digging into Greek word origins, and looking at linguistics from all sorts of angles. So the problems of language are really faced head on, it seems to me. You can't look at French structuralism, post-structuralism, and say, oh, these guys dodged the issue of language. It's a fairly courageous, very courageous confrontation with it. That was their preoccupation. And as a result of dragging the problem of language into the center stage, everyone benefits, because now everyone who's had even a slight bit of contact with that world is more attentive and more precise and more interested in better able to understand and imagine how transformations in language produce all sorts of effects in personal thinking, in the culture at large, and so on. Now, in this totally different world of Buddhist studies, the word hasn't really reached them yet. Many of them, it seems to me. I've looked at some volumes of journal articles with what's supposed to be the best work, and a few articles here and there sort of have this critical approach, but many of them don't. And So that's what struck me as being valuable about the work on this blog, that somebody's going back, trying to figure out, based on the texts, based on the evidence, what was said, what was miscopied, and so on and so forth, and then saying, okay, given all of this, what can we suppose was really going on? Because I think even in the Western tradition, if you take, let's say, a more modern philosopher, you take someone like Nietzsche. I mean, I don't think there's much issue with his texts today as far as, whether there's a critical edition or not. There is a very highly reliable critical edition. The manuscripts we have, only very, very small issues about what word was used and when and so on. So here we have basically his words, his body of thought surviving. And any body of thought is going to have an organic nature. It's going to support itself internally. It's going to be full of interrelations. And any human being reader encountering the text, the sort of testament to some other human being's thought, is going to get a lot out of that that's just existing in implication. You know what I mean? There's a lot more to it than just the words on the page, provided that the words on the page are conveyed correctly. But if you end up with a garbled version that's passed down over 1,000 years, you have to find, I think, if you are a normal human being trying to encounter or engage this thought of another human being, albeit one in the past, that it's not there. And that's something I've encountered with Buddhism in the past, is something that I've felt that whatever it is that they're feeding you, in English, for example, I don't sense that there's a human being thinking this. It's opaque. It's it's corrupted, really. It's what it comes down to. And then when you look at this guy's recent article, for example, on form's emptiness, and you get back to his reconstruction of what kind of was really at stake in the earliest stages, you're like, oh, now this has a kind of organic quality to it. It's very plausible. It makes sense for all sorts of reasons. And you think, this is probably more like it.
Well, I immediately think of, one thing that struck me, just getting back to the early stages of Christianity, is that I remember being shocked by the fact that the Church of Jesus, or his Sangha, for want of a better word, was effectively destroyed by the Roman conquest of Jerusalem 40-odd years after his death. What was his actual community of followers was essentially annihilated. And then what survives to this day are the teachings as remembered by what were peripheral fragments to the actual church, even if it conceived of itself as such. And just even logically, you're forced to conclude that perhaps we are now facing, or we're left with this legacy of just a series of monstrous untruths that through human effort have elevated themselves to what the Rosicrucians call an egregore, a collective, a subconscious energetic structure which is a life unto itself, that sort of breathes validation into, in this instance, the Christianity we have today.
Well, I'm with you. The possibility that so much more than we ever realized that we know is in error is something that most people don't want to confront. You mentioned the scenario in which there's a historical Jesus whose followers are wiped out very early on. There's a massive gap. And then what forms the genesis of texts like the Gospels later, and maybe the the epistles of Paul and so on, begin in an oral tradition, which may be very unreliable. But it may be worse than that, of course. There are plenty of people who view the situation in a different light and say that, well, probably there was no historical Jesus at all, and that the whole thing is a kind of retroactive fiction. When you look at all the numerous strands of the early Christianities, the ones that today are kind of gathered together under the term Gnosticism, and you see the affinities between this particular strand of Christianity and some other mystery cult or local religion here and the same thing over there, it's really remarkable. And
Sure.
it could be the same situation with Buddhism. You could have a group of people who constitute a milieu, and they are generational. Maybe they exist in something like a monastery. Maybe they're ascetics who simply live collectively in the jungle. You don't know. And maybe because of a variety of influences, all of a sudden there's this figure who's thought of. And let me be more precise about it, because it's really a really remarkable historical problem. You can approach it from two angles. You know, there's a book written by a French historian named Paul Vane, and the title in English is something like, Did the Greeks Believe Their Myths? And his thesis is that belief for the ancient Greeks was something, in a way, very different than what we regard belief as today. And that for them, the Greek gods, for example, were real, but they didn't exist in time and space, normal time and space. For example, we take it for granted that if something is real, then it's got to exist in a particular place and at a particular time. Well, this in its own way is a construct. It's a connection between two different spheres of cognition. And his view, more or less, put my way, is that the ancient Greeks entertained this kind of world of Greek gods and events, and they could tell you who did what to whom, and this happened and that happened, without ever feeling the pressure or the need to relate it to actual history and geography and so on. Now, in some of the historians who came later, and you saw this much more among the Romans, but there were even a few Greeks, you could see the tendency beginning in its nascent stages. For example, Herodotus, I believe, tried to determine where and when Hercules lived. But, you know, that's something that itself was like a historical development. The idea is that there's this cognitive neverland where these gods are real. So you've got that in play. So we put that on one side. On the other side, which I think is very significant, and somebody ought to write something relating these two, because it's really, I think, crucial. The development of writing itself, the increased prevalence of writing, the fact that around the time of 200, 100 BC, writing as a means of record keeping in religious orders became possible sort of in a widespread way for the first time. Now, up until that time, everything is more or less sustained by oral tradition. But all of a sudden around that time, probably because of technology and commerce and so on, and it's the same in the Buddhist areas as in the pre-Christian areas, you have this sudden possibility that things can be written. How does that distort the social religious landscape? I think it's quite significant if you think about it. You go from a venue in which people get together in some sort of sacred or holy place. They recite from memory. There's something intrinsic about speech. It's gone. As soon as you speak, it's gone. But writing, obviously, stays there. Now, writing at that time, obviously, can only be read by the very, very few, the elect. What does that mean? That introduces a kind of stratification and distortion that wasn't there before. It's not to say that there was no stratification before, but you see what I mean. I mean, you introduce a whole new transformation into the structure of the social religious environment with writing. How do the people who have been taught to read and who are at a given religious installation regard writing itself? A holy text? What does it mean? And what does it mean when they start writing texts? You see, this is where we get to it. In an environment where what we would call today religious belief exists in a kind of cognitive neverland, where there's simply no connection made with the perceived need to relate things believed to actuality. And on the other hand, for the first time, people gaining access to whatever it was they were writing on, although it was obviously very limited and most population didn't have it, the fact is religious orders started for the first time to be able to start writing all sorts of things down across the board. What do you have? I would argue, and I would be gratified if I could find somebody else who argues the same thing, but I would argue that these people in these religious orders started to write things down that they were dreaming up, and yet, even though they were dreaming them up as they went, they also believed. When you look at a lot of the gospel material, there's a term, I think, I hope I'm not getting it wrong, because there are a couple, but I think it's called a midrash. If that's not it, there's another very related Hebrew term in which you would go to a scripture and interpret today's events in the light of some event in Scripture from what's believed to be the distant past. What ends up happening in the Gospels is that they retell events again and again and again in the Hebrew Scriptures, but now with different characters, now with New Testament characters and so on. And doing so, they thought that they were not falsifying or hoaxing something. They thought that they were, in a way, offering a religious interpretation. To them, it had total reality. So you've got that in play as well. So I think when it comes to Buddhism and when it comes to Christianity, if it turns out to be true that there was never any historical Jesus or any historical Buddha, and the question gets raised, well, how in the hell could these people come up with this? I think those are the axes within which you see the scenarios unfold, because they're able to believe at the same time that they create. You see this in Gnosticism. I mean, these people today regarded as Gnostics, the Valentinians and so on, were creating these wild myths, and they were doing it in front of each other. And yet at the same time, these myths that they would create had a kind of sacred status. Now you would say, well, somebody just wrote that. And moreover, again, to bring in things traditionally done in those days, you write something, you attribute it to somebody else. So you say, well, this is from the Apostle Paul, and you write this discourse. It wasn't Paul who wrote it. You wrote it 50 years later. Now, are you hoaxing? On the one hand, certainly you're trying to gain the authority of the Apostle Paul. So that's why so many of these Gospels were assigned to purported disciples of Christ, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of John, and so on. There's very little evidence to suggest that any of those apostles existed, that they wrote the things at all, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they didn't. But it's not simply, however, just to write something and to gain authority from a figure from the past. but it's also because as you're writing it, you actually believe in it religiously. The thing that you create, you regard as having a kind of religiosity. That's my view at any rate. That's how I can kind of see and perceive how all these things got started.
Well, sure, and and as you talk of we'll just say the muddied origins of Buddhism and Christianity, it does make me think of the dangers inherent in contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, because it's always useful to, and I know we've spoken about this before, you run the thought experiment as to how the conversation would go. And quite early in the piece, I'm sure you would approach the fact that they are much older than we, and that they have been observing us intimately for a long time. As such, they have access to truer histories of our world than we have. And that information, you would have to imagine, would hit the collective human consciousness like a neutron bomb. It would kill so much. It would destroy so much by leaving the outward structures standing. It reminds me of what Billy Meyer's supposed contact. They said at one stage they were willing for open engagement with Western governments if they would accept the idea that their entire religious belief systems were based on lies. And I think that if in that contact situation, where that conversation was to arise, there'd be this moment of enormous pathos would come when I'd imagine ethically these beings would have to admit, yes, at hand, we actually know your history. We actually know who these people were. And so then you go through the histories and you deal with someone like the Buddha, which incidentally is such a blatantly mythic life story. I'm surprised it's not more closely questioned. You know, the boy born with the birthmark to be a world conqueror, he's a prince. You know, it's almost almost like a very obvious myth. And then say Muhammad too. If it comes to the fact, say Muhammad he's just a military leader, he's trying to impose political order, and he just grabs upon whatever spiritual doctrines he can put his hands on. Well, that obviously will have very profound consequences or profound effects.
Yeah, I see it the exact same way. As regards extraterrestrials, I mean, if you, through this lens that we're creating, if you glimpse just how stupid we might well be, then you can see why, on the one hand, every time we have an extraterrestrial encounter, they feed us some new bullshit myth, some new story about I'm from Venus, I'm from Mars, we're from the Pleiades, we do this, we do that. Each time it's like a bullshit story because from their point of view, you couldn't give human beings anything but a bullshit story. You wouldn't want to give them the truth, anything but the truth. I mean, it would be like, you go out into the jungle and you've got the gorillas there. And I know these analogies are used all the time, but I would use this one in this very particular sense. I mean, say you really want to get through to these gorillas. You want to communicate to them. You want to interact with them. You would say in their current condition as gorillas, it's fucking useless. Now, obviously, people would take a starting place and know automatically, well, you can't go out and talk and communicate and, express yourself to a gorilla. But let's just say that you wanted to. The fact is, if you went out there and you grappled with the issue, you struggled with it, you would find, well, in their current state, it's impossible. Well, that may be the situation that they have with us. It's simply not possible in our current state. So that's the one thing. But I think I've passed my second point, but so if you have something, go right ahead.
Well, sure, yeah, and you know what that does say to me is that the problems there that arise from our basic limitation to really proceed from this moment in light of a recognition of extensive past error in and of itself is enough to guarantee that an open contact won't occur. It's even like your small interaction with this guy on his blog. You try to raise a point about the French philosophical tradition, the modern philosophical tradition there, and it's shut down. You're not even allowed to speak. The comment isn't. I mean, and this thing that kind of makes me laugh. I mean, I was thinking today. I read what you wrote before when I had to go out of work, and I was thinking about it. I was going to write a reply, and I was thinking of something that it was Adida at one stage. He was trying to explain some point about in his own idiosyncratic way that he was sitting there with a student, and he happened to be watching a porno, and it was two lesbians going at it, and one had a strap on, but she was really she was a real lesbian. She wasn't going through the motions, excuse the pun, but she was really had this look in her face apparently where she's really trying to feel what it's like for a man to actually give it to a woman, actually fucking give it to her, and but of course she couldn't. She couldn't feel it. She doesn't have the physical disposition. And in the same way, I find that this website, this blog, these people who are seemingly hell-bent on establishing some authority for themselves in the realm of spiritual thought, they're a little like this lesbian with the strap on. They're trying and they're trying and they're trying, and it just isn't fucking working. I note from this man's self-description, he's just fucking marketing. He's talking himself up. Well, I've done this, I've done that. I did an introductory. I ordered Sanskrit at Cambridge University, and in a way, I think, to be honest, I think it's a fucking pathetic response to the Buddhist teaching to dedicate yourself to some sort of ongoing, obscure survey of the literature. Now, I mean obscure in the fact that it's not a popular concern. Because ultimately what the Buddha would say is, you're in a limited condition. You're in the wheel of life. You're in an entropic condition. You're going to suffer and continue to suffer unless you liberate oneself. That's the whole teaching of Buddhism. But with that comes a core Buddhist teaching, is the Buddhist instruction to be a refuge unto yourself. Put no head above your own. That ultimately it's your own exploration, your own discovery, your own authority is that which you live by, albeit in a very qualified sense. And so what then you have is someone who sort of, in his effort to establish this authority for himself, in this effort to acquire an exotic personal culture, which I'm sure makes him a much more fascinating dinner time conversationalist, he then he has deeply attached to this an enormous parody of a Buddhist teaching. He displays vast attachment to that thought in response to a thought and series of questions which would invalidate and undermine the power of that attachment, at least in his own mind.
Well, that's very well put, and I'm with you entirely. I'll describe, since it hasn't been done yet, the details of the encounter, to put it briefly, and without making more of it than it was. This particular blog, the Yaya Rava Raves blog, is the one mentioned we were discussing a bit ago. And in my opinion, there's good work along the lines of the kind of work that I would like to see done with Buddhism. Having scanned the blog over the past couple of days, I've tried to get a sense of the character who was behind the blog, and there were a few red flags that went up. For one, he seems to be this particular breed of Buddhist who is also secular, quote unquote. In other words, they, let's say, secular and skeptic in the internet sense. So you'll see among his favorites a blog called Neuroskeptic, and you'll see among his past writings articles against a belief in any afterlife. Also in comment sections underneath past blog posts, the guy has behaved in what was pretty obviously a heavy-handed manner at different times. I observed that. Nonetheless, my personal feeling about the work that I've read, I thought this was very useful and very helpful. I mean, this is first rate when compared to other blogs. I mean, who is doing academic level work on a blog? Practically nobody. So I read with interest the latest essay, which is a 3-part posting on this business concerning the Heart Sutra and form is emptiness. Read it with interest and enjoyed it. But in part 3, I think, he made some sort of very disappointing dig at French postmodernism. Now, the guy's British, and I've heard this same type of dig before from many British would-be intellectuals and bona fide intellectuals. They just can't stand French postmodernism, and it's an attitude based in chauvinism. It's the same type of chauvinism that requires French intellectuals to hate Americans. I mean, Derrida, for example, is a virtuoso first-rate thinker, as far as I'm concerned. But if you watch the Derrida documentary that was made 10, 15 years ago or more, the documentary opens with him crossing the street, and he can't fail but to turn the crossing the street into some sort of dig at the Americans. To me, this is all just juvenile, but it happens nonetheless. Anyway, the blog article contained this dig at French postmodernism, and without naming names, it nevertheless dismissed it all, basically according to the same line that you hear again and again and again, that, oh, they're just intentionally obscure, they're just trying to sound smart, they're using big words. It's the same kind of bullshit. So I wrote a reply to the article. I said, thanks for this great work. This is exactly the kind of work I would like to see done on Buddhism. And then I put in the paragraph saying, by the way, this dig at postmodernism strikes me as being cheap or ill-informed. And I tried to suggest a distinction between the real thinkers and these second or third-rate academics who exist in huge numbers. Let's not kid ourselves. They fill American universities, but also British universities and also European universities. These academics who are not strong thinkers in any sense, nevertheless take this term and this phrase and this bit of jargon, and they just endlessly redeploy these linguistic bits. It's all pure rank imitation, and they all do it for each other's benefit, so nobody calls bullshit on it. Now, to me, you can pick up Derrida or Foucault, and sure, at the start, because you're not a part of their world, it's off-putting. And sure, you might well have an emotional reaction and say, this is bullshit because it makes me uncomfortable because it's obviously not talking to a world that I belong to, and therefore, really what you're saying is, I feel like I don't exist. Fine, but if you, for whatever reason, are able to apply yourself just a few minutes longer or a few days longer, just a little bit longer, you'll overcome that obstacle and begin to enter into the world of thought, and then you'll quickly realize this is real thought. In the same way that listening to a Beethoven symphony, you realize this is a symphony pretty quickly. You realize that these people are not imitators, they're not fools, they're not hoaxers, these thinkers like a Derrida, Foucault, Lacan are every bit as major thinkers as Hegel, Kant, Nietzsche. You can go back as far as you want. They are the real thing. Now, all these bullshit American, largely academic imitators is a different story, obviously. I put that in comment.
Well, I I
Go
do
ahead.
think, in fairness, to what I picked up on the blog, was he made reference to an American professor of analytic philosophy. I think it was a guy called Sear.
Yeah,
Um,
John Searle.
Searle, sorry, and he made some remark where I think Foucault disclosed to him that the reason for the disparity between the clarity of his spoken word and the obscurity of his written word was the need to appear, the need to respond to the supposed cultural standards of the French intellectual elite of Paris. And Searle then takes from that a license, as I understand it, to be more whole-scale dismissive of some of the writings of postmodernism. And I think this blogger takes Searle at his word and takes those ideas at their face.
Well, what you say is accurate, but the interpretation I would give it is different. It's not a matter of being fair to the blogger and saying, this blogger, based on this piece of evidence, comes to this conclusion. It seems to me obvious from my point of view that he shares the same prejudice as Searle, and therefore Searle's pretty trite anecdote simply reinforces his prejudice. Of course, he passes this off as something authoritative because if you're already within that Anglo-American mindset, then someone like Searle is authoritative and credible to be taken seriously, whereas these French clowns are not. I would say that at the heart of all this is something, it's psychology in action, and I can tell you why. The fact is that what Foucault supposedly said to Searle can be taken many, many different ways. And it's not because it's some sort of ambiguous remark, but simply because it's a remark of a certain amount of sophistication that nevertheless could be given different interpretations. And the fact that so many of these British and American thinkers leap to the one single interpretation tells you something about what's going on. And as they have a desire, they want to leap to that interpretation. But you see a kind of naive psychology at work in these Anglo-American types in a variety of different places. For example, there's an anecdote about Lacan coming to MIT back in the, I think the 70s, somewhere around there. And obviously English wasn't Lacan's native language, but he went before some sort of group of professors, including Noam Chomsky, of all people. And Lacan made several remarks that sound ridiculous. In English, he said, for example, that I have no proof that something like this. I'm probably getting the remark wrong, but the general idea is there. I have no proof that I have an inside unless I have a stomach ache. Or I have no proof even that I have a head unless I bump it against the wall. Now, these remarks sound so completely outside of academic sophistication for MIT science-minded professors that they need to be dismissed. And Chomsky's conclusion, which he's maintained to this day, is that Lacan was a conscious charlatan. That's his phrase. So from start to finish, there's nothing to Lacan's work. It was all just a hoax, basically, in the same manner of a UFO hoax. He had nothing to say. And the fact that he lectured at these prestigious institutions for decades in France can be put down to the fact that basically the French are fools, right? The French wanted a hoax because they're kind of these aesthetic maniacs, and that's what the French do. They're all crazy. Now just think about that. I mean, really, really is that? I mean, we ought to be more sensitive at this point to cartoonish caricature.
Right.
So now you have another anecdote, which Anglo-American types will believe is absolute gospel. Like, oh, there it is. There's the proof. They do that. Now, this same guy, Searle, got into, unfortunately for him, a scrap with Derrida. It was a quote-unquote debate, but it was really back and forth through several published papers and pieces in succession. And Derrida annihilated the guy. And you can hear stories from, again, more anecdotes, other American professors who were friends of Searle's, and they would call him, oh, poor Searle. Oh, he didn't know what he was getting himself into. He just couldn't understand it. These poor milquetoast Americans, they've lost even the idea that polemic has a place in philosophy. But anyway, Derrida mopped the floor with him in the end, at the level of argument, at the level of philosophy. Even though in a way they were speaking two totally different languages, because for the Anglo-Americans, linguistic expression can be transparent. You can eliminate ambiguity from linguistic expression entirely. Everything, and this goes all the way back to logical positivism, the biases there and so on, the idea that sure, we can solve philosophical problems simply by eliminating them. If you can't express a logical argument in propositional language of formal logic, it doesn't exist. It's not meaningful, therefore it doesn't exist. We cut it out. Voila, we've solved all of the age-old philosophical problems. This was their own insanity. But the bias, the tendency still exists. The idea that you can unambiguously present a philosophical argument and so on and so forth. From the French and the continental tradition, this is nonsense because of their accidental contact with linguistics earlier in the 20th century, and they're grappling with the problem of language thanks to Heidegger and so on. They really had a highly developed idea that language was something that was endlessly complex and created the problems as well as solved them. So when Derrida wrote, for example, he was not just writing some sort of list of bullet points of philosophical theses. He was advancing a philosophical argument at the same time as he was doing a literary performance. Now, to the extent that literary performance is desired or was desired in France, yes, you could say that the French artistic and intellectual environment called for certain kinds of, what's the word I'm looking for? Flamboyance. And they have obviously their own tradition as well within which they operate. So it's not that there would be zero truth in what Foucault said, but you could easily interpret what Foucault said in that light. I mean, they have their own traditions. They have their own kind of very colorful style. They're not going to abandon that colorful style in order to engage some dry American academic. It's absurd. Anyway.
Well,
I'll make another. Well, go ahead.
Sure, well, I was just going to say, it seems almost as if we've come back to the beginning, back to this issue of violence, because it strikes me is that I've spoken on this before, I have next to no knowledge of the French philosophical tradition in the 20th century. I know nothing of postmodernism, never studied it, had a passing interest in it. I think I may have shared this anecdote before, but my knowledge of Foucault, I think, derives from the time I was in my university bookshop, looking at the, those little cheat sheets on various thinkers. There was a stack there of, great thinkers in 60 pages with some cartoons, one of these little books. And I think I made my way through one of Foucault and one of Derrida. I might have been 19 or 20, and that was it. And it struck me as important, but also I could say I knew nothing about it. And even now, recently, I was making my way through some Lacan, and I actually did see that. It's just how difficult the text was, how demanding the text was. And you have this reaction that I've picked up on. It's made its way into the serious press from time to time. These jibes at the likes of Foucault, Lacan, Derrida. For instance, I recall there was a mock paper presented to some journal and was accepted, where, in point of fact, in my understanding, if I remember correctly, it was written by an American physicist who had taken umbrage at the obvious nonsense he saw in the field of, I think it was postmodern literary criticism, and took it upon himself to send it up by just writing what was, obviously a lengthy exercise in sustained nonsense, and he had it accepted. And so then it became a minor cause célèbre, which is to say, yeah, you see, it is nonsense. I know it's nonsense because what I wrote was complete nonsense. Now, this in itself,
yeah.
there's this reaction. It's just more violence because it's rested on what is just even intelligently, just to look at it just cognitively, a strange idea. Here we have a country and a culture with a very proud intellectual history and with not an insignificant amount of intellectual achievement. And so now we are to say that they have produced, in the area of abstract thought, a sustained exercise in nonsense and irrelevance. That itself seems to be a nonsensical and almost irrelevant argument, particularly when you retain the idea that in no other country do so many people study philosophy, at least at the baccalaureate level. So there is definitely, objectively, a developed philosophical tradition in that nation, even if you know nothing about it, like me. I do know that there really is a French philosophical tradition that really is as marked by achievement and really is sustained by vast amount of collective energy. Now, to reject that out of hand is an appallingly violent act. And if the word that comes to mind is barbaric, because there is that something I even notice in myself. To actually face something and to say, I really do not understand this. To be candid enough with oneself that you can see that there is a body of thought that not only you don't understand, but present there, almost like those ancient maps. Here be monsters, here be dragons. That, as I take it from speaking with you, from the little I can pick up, that there are considerations for psychological and linguistic approaches which would, if I understood them, would probably do some damage to some of the governing assumptions of my own living over the last 10, 15 years. And that in itself is quite humbling, but it's a necessary part of an honest human exploration of this field. Because ultimately, even for those people who are au fait with this area, perforce that knowledge has been purchased at the expense of ignorance of other fields of study. So this problem of just ignorance and humility and a very contingent knowing is one shared by all of us, even if rarely it's acknowledged and accepted.
Here. It's impossible for anybody to master every domain of study or even to be acquainted with it. And in addition to that, it's very understandable and forgivable when people have internal built-up resistances to certain things of which they know little. The question is whether they persist when those resistances are, felt out or not. Now, I can say that in my youth, in my teenage years, my philosophical orientation really amounted to American transcendentalism and Nietzsche. And to me, that was a powerful mix. And when I first encountered postmodern, post-structuralism, and so on, I had an enormous, even physical resistance to it. For example, Lacan struck me as disgustingly absurd on two counts. On the one hand, you have psychoanalysis, which we all know is already nonsense. But on the other hand, you have these mathematical diagrams in the text. I mean, what kind of bullshit is this? And the fact that it's coming from some sort of already outdated 1950s, 1960s environment of cybernetics and so on, I thought this is just the worst. This is garbage in the biggest possible way. And similar things with Foucault or Derrida. I mean, Foucault, homosexual, writing a lot of bullshit about history and that, this and that, and bald, trendy French thinker. Well, that's his story. And Derrida, well, his stuff basically comes down to bullshit for feminist literary theorists to pass off, to take his terms and to pretend that they're writing provocative intellectual fare. So, this is how all this stuff immediately struck me. But at the same time, if I have to piece out why I didn't stick with that resistance, this is for a couple of related reasons. On the one hand, I had experience growing up playing music. And the phenomenon of virtuosity was something to me that was undeniable. It was something you could guide your ship by. I mean, when one musician is a virtuoso above all the others, it's undeniable. You cannot kid yourself about that. And at least in the music performance world, classical music and so on, with all of the bullshit in the world today, you really don't encounter cases, I can't think of one, where somebody is a bona fide rock solid virtuoso and yet they're still dismissed as bullshit. In the visual arts world, even, this happens. Painters, it happens to them all the time. Their work is dismissed as bullshit. It's derided 30 years later after they're dead. All of a sudden, these are all masterpieces. But anyway, that kind of virtuosity is undeniable. And if you wanted to say so, although there's much less bullshit in this world, but the world of sport. I mean, if you can run that 100 meters or 400 meters in a world record time, people don't sit there and argue about whether you're the best runner or not. I mean, if you just break a world record, it's pretty fucking unambiguous in the world of sport. So, but I think it's related, virtuosity. Anyway, so if you have a sense for that, that's one thing. The second is that based on my own, probably what you'd call psychological makeup, I've always been deathly afraid of the type of error that's introduced with ego identifications. There's always been this terror in me, and it's produced a kind of pattern where you could say, that like the shark has to keep moving or it dies. So on the one hand, I had this, 49% visceral resistance to this crazy French crap. And the fact that at the school I was at, the main evangelist for this stuff with this kind of dwarfish, decadent, it struck me as very monstrous, this particular guy, Chicago Jew who, the guy was just awful. He struck me as a kind of perversion. And all of that really made me resistant to it. So that was 49% of me, but the 51% was all the rest. And bashing my brain through those texts, reading them, even though I didn't understand a single damn word in many cases, I nonetheless sensed that this was not bullshit, that there was virtuosity there. If you have a sense for that, it can save you in a case like that. And what ended up happening was that over the space of many years in my 20s, I got to the point where, at least at one point, I had philosophically at least mastered Derrida and Lacan. You know it when you achieve it, because finally these major blocks fall into place. You can express things in terms of your own language without making it cheap or without reducing it. You can move it around in your own mind. Now you finally got it. So I got through all of that. And my attitude, naturally, like any naif, is if I can do it, why can't somebody else? Now, when you've got this jerk-off who is a Buddhist, he's a lifelong practicing meditator, he's writing academic quality journal articles, blog posts, and so on. My first inclination is to think he's better than I am, which I think is a natural thing to do. And then when you see these slip-ups, these bullshit conceits, you want to call them out on and say, hey, listen, asshole. And, you know, one thing I didn't even get the chance to really get into. So I wrote, we've gotten sidetracked on the basic details of the story. I wrote the comment, he wrote back a bullshit reply where he said, for example, even though it was dismissive, what I said, it wasn't cheap or misinformed. The postmodernists have made their bed, let them lie in it. It's just nonsense. That's just saying I really don't like them another way. That's not answering what I said, that there's a distinction between the bona fide thinkers and the bullshit drooling imitators. I wrote him back another comment where I just floored him, as far as I'm concerned. And I said, listen, the same thing you describe in the Buddhist tradition of, you know, people corrupting texts and writing a lot of bullshit and so on, is exactly what you see today with the French postmodern thinkers, and you should, you know, you just ignored the distinction I made in order to boo-hoo about it. And then the point I made at the end, which is really what galls me, the guy did not allow the comment to post because it made him look too bad. But the point I wanted to make at the end is that there is a very close kinship between some very basic Buddhist ideas and the French post-structuralist ideas. It's appallingly obvious, the similarity. And I'll try to put it very briefly. You know, I'm not going to adhere to the normal terminology. I want to get at the concepts, the basic understanding. The idea that everyday experience, right, for Buddhists is an illusion, because the idea that, for example, you can say this thing or that thing is distinct and therefore real and therefore I'm paying attention to it, and therefore it's captivating, is based on the distinctiveness of its quote-unquote form, which right now we'll say is the sum totality of all of its distinctive qualities, each of which, viewed in isolation, is a single form, quote-unquote. And the fact is that everyday people, the great unwashed, they take the everyday world at face value. They take it as a priori meaningful. You know, there's an obvious meaning to this chair, and the meaning is exactly my phenomenological perception of it. They don't see things, including their perception of things, the very construct of a thing, as being dependent. Dependent. You hear this all the time in discussions of Buddhism. The question of causes and conditions, dependency. Things being dependent on causes and conditions. The simple fact that everything exists only by virtue of its dependencies on other things means that things themselves have no inherent existence. There's nothing in the thing that makes it real. So you only have this system of interrelationships, a system of relations. Therefore, it's kind of virtual. Everything is virtual. And so Buddhists say, therefore, that again, I'm, you know, give me some leeway. But, you know, Buddhists will say that everything's an illusion on account of that fact. That what you think is real, you take a thing to exist as a single thing or event. It's really just a virtual point in a web of interrelationships, and nothing exists because it's all interrelationship. Then, of course, they take it further and they apply it to the self. And they say, well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, because if you look at yourself, it's the same type of thing. So there's no self in you either. And, of course, the moral or ethical or the affective teaching from that is, supposedly when you really realize this completely, you disappear, the world disappears, you reach enlightenment or awakening, which is the end of suffering, yada, yada, yada. So that core concept of there being nothing existing by itself, nothing that can be isolated, everything existing only by virtue of its interrelationships. What is the whole point of Derrida? What's the whole point of post-structuralism? It's basically that everything we say and think exists in a set of linguistic interrelationships. There is no thought or feeling, according to somebody like a Derrida, that can be isolated separate from its linguistic expression, because everything you think and feel is always already linguistically mediated. The whole concept of language that the French post-structuralists use, from which we get the term structuralism, comes from the word structure. Ferdinand de Saussure, who was a Swiss linguist in the very beginning of the 20th century, who described language as basically a virtual set of interrelationships. When you look at the basic unit of sound that's produced physically by the human being, the phoneme, his concept was the phoneme has no existence in and of itself, but only by virtue of its difference from other phonemes. So the sounds p and b, you can never isolate any of those sounds. For one, every time a human being produces a sound, a p or a b, if you analyze it at the maximum magnification, it's always unique, because every physical event in reality is unique. But the fact is that a p is sustained by its difference from a b, simply by the distance between the two. And doing a comparative study of languages, you see this, because in one language you might have, let's say, a system of 30 phonemes. And a very nearby related language, maybe with the same historical origin, has 31 phonemes, an extra one. And what ends up happening is that the people who speak the language with 31 phonemes are able to understand and perceive all of the sounds made by the other group. But the group of people who speak the language with 30 phonemes, when they hear the language spoken by that other group, they don't even hear the sound, that extra sound, because cognitively they can't register it. It does not exist within the system of differences. So things existing only within a system of differences, this is the core concept. Now you hear the story or the anecdote, whatever you want to call it, about the Eskimos who might have 30 words for snow. We might have one word for snow, they've got 30. Now, we go up there and we look at the snow and we can't see 30 types of snow. We simply can't. But if they're born and raised in that system of differences, and how would they ultimately isolate the difference? Ultimately, it comes down to one just being different from another. You look at the color spectrum, right? The color spectrum is a continuum. There is no hard and fast difference per se between one color and the next. But we overlay on that pure continuum a set of linguistic differences. We can never pin down the exact point where one color breaks into another. But our linguistic system, which becomes a cognitive system, is a system of distinctions by virtue of which we're able to roughly refer to color. And we do this all the time. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. So you go from the smallest level of the linguistic units all the way up to our philosophies, our ideologies, sustained by differences, systems of differences. What does a philosopher do when he starts out? He starts off making distinctions. And in the end, what you find is those distinctions are meaningful within his philosophy. But then when you get to another philosopher with a different set of distinctions, you can't translate them.
If I may, just I've been dying to ask you, and did you have a look at claims for the alien language in the CART documents. Does that ring a bell with you?
The self-activating software part.
Sure, but do you remember the part where the Isaac individual is talking about the nature of the language, and he uses, oh shit, how does it go? But he takes this imagery that we see, these extraordinary arcs and swirls, and where he said that with human language, there are Lego-like structures which build upon each other. Letters into words, words into sentences, sentence, paragraphs, pages, so on. But he said with this imagery that it is all conceived of at once. And all elements are related to the other. So if you change one small part, you can have a radically different meaning across all the information that is otherwise contained. And he gives the example. He said, if you took the game where you have to, you can come up with a word from just using the letters of the alphabet, and then in each successive term, what you have to do is come up with a word without using letters you previously used. He said the task at hand is if you were to do that with an alphabet which is infinite in length. And so he said the task in structuring this language was, as they tried to use these terms for programming, they said that it took teams and teams of people using whatever computational power they had at hand it was utterly painstaking work, if I remember this correctly. And then he just adds to that. He said, word was, and this is almost a direct quote, he said, word was, the aliens could do this in their head. Which, for those people working on the team, they thought the idea that we could offer any sort of meaningful resistance to them to be utterly ludicrous. Because if an ant-heap were to resist a herd of stampeding buffalo, I think that's even the analogy he uses. But I just wanted to ask, had you looked into this? These claims in the CART document about the language and descriptions of the language, because I thought it was quite involved for the usual hoaxed fare, if that's what it was. There was some very interesting comments about language, and if someone just made all this stuff up, there was a good streak of some real creativity involved.
Well, it's quite interesting. I'd be happy to, blather a bit about it if you like.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Well, right off the bat, it's a trivial observation that human communication takes place temporally. That is, one word follows another word in time. If we could convey the contents of a novel, all the words in a novel, instantaneously, you might imagine what it would look like if every word in the novel were printed on top of every other word. Let's say we have just one page in the novel and all the words are printed on top of each other. So it's obvious to demonstrate that human communication unfolds in time. So what seems to be being discussed here, what you've described and what I've just glanced at is something interesting to think about, whether it's real or not. And that is, to reiterate, the idea that, well, when you say, for example, that you cannot use any previous word in this particular game, but that there are an infinite number of letters, or whatever it was, you can't use previous letters, but there are an infinite number of letters. What that really conveys is that basically you are creating new language with each deployment of language, if you think about it. So in everyday human communication, over the course of history, people do suddenly, spontaneously invent new words, new expressions. And oftentimes, other people hearing those new words for the first time, nonetheless, instantly understand what it means. You wouldn't have memes and neologisms spreading like wildfire all the time if that weren't the case. If it were absolutely true that a new word with which you're unfamiliar was impossible to understand, no new words would ever catch on, but they do all the time. So you have to then ask yourself, well, what is really going on with understanding in that case? Well, even though the structure of language can be thought of as distinct, it does take place within a cognitive environment. And even though you can never separate the cognitive environment from its linguistic structuring, it is nevertheless true that when someone is shown a word, what they think of, what they associate with the word is a complex cognitive ensemble. And that is something we can call meaning. Now you have to be careful because you can only meaningfully talk about meaning so far. This particular Buddhist character who thinks that basically every word has to carry with it an obvious meaning, that's retarded. That's an uncritical look at language. That's as bad as the everyday person thinking that the phenomenal world is obvious and transparent, at least from the point of view of the Buddhist. That's, criminal. But anyway, the fact is that you cannot separate the quote-unquote meaning from linguistic expression. So if I show you a word on a card, and let's say the word is sheep or Christmas tree or whatever it is, and you have a set of associations, you experience something, a whole kind of mishmash of sense and association, then I say to you, what did you associate with that? You would have to put that into words. And the point is the kind of expectation of people who are postmodernists, post-structuralists, but also cognitive scientists is that a lot of, if not all of your experience is already kind of linguistically mediated because the brain is totally interrelated with itself. So probably in some way that mess of experience that you felt, that you had in your mind, was somewhat already primed for a kind of linguistic expression. Anyway, saying all of that, how do you get to this carrot material? Well, it seems to me, number one, that if you're talking about their language being like a game in which you cannot use any previous letters, but you have an infinite number of letters to choose from, what you're in effect saying is that every time you communicate, you are able to, in fact, you must create a new word. Every word you create is new. Now, for that to still be a functioning language, it would mean that every new word you create is also immediately understood. So taking it back to the idea of a neologism or a meme expression or something, some new phrase or catchphrase or something that, because it's never been used before, nobody should understand, yet everybody seems to understand it. Well, what if your whole language felt like that? What if it operated like that? What if every word that appeared was new and unlike any previous word, but everybody understood it with the kind of immediate understanding that humans have when a catchphrase or a new coinage appears? What if every Egyptian hieroglyphic were new and was unlike any previous hieroglyphic, and yet somehow contained within it the basis for meaning? the basis for being understood. Well, it seems to me that we're approaching what is being described, whether fictively or not, in this carrot material. In the carrot material, based on what you sent me, you have the description of these words, these units of communication, as being equivalent to computer programs. They can initialize, they describe, they conclude. So basically, it's an organized system of language contained within. An Egyptian hieroglyph is like that. You've got a number of elements existing in interrelation, and unlike a simple phoneme or a morpheme or word whose meaning is derived more elsewhere, you can say to some extent the content is localizable in a hieroglyphic. Now, if you're talking about the carrot material, that's how that sounds as well. So it seems to me that what you would have, if that scenario were to exist, you would have people using the language who were cognitively complex enough to be able to devise a new word every time and yet understand it in the exact same way that we talk about when, with catchphrases spreading and so on. And that the units of communication, these words, if you want an analogy, would be like an Egyptian hieroglyph because they're complex, there's an inside to them. And the type of communication involved, if you want to get down to it sort of cognitively, I would again mention the idea of the flashcard. If somebody shows you a flashcard and it says fish, with what do you associate? There is some cognitive content there. The same goes for them. They encounter this new word, and it somehow is evocative of a vast amount of cognitive content. Enough cognitive content with enough detail and precision, this is the difference probably between them and us, if we're entertaining this as actual, that it's actionable material. Like they say in the clandestine world, actionable intelligence. There's enough resolution that we can see what's in the image. For them, you've got this symbol or this unit of communication, and it's able to convey to them, thanks to their minds, their brains, the brains are able to respond to it with enough resolution of image and subtlety of information that there's a lot of cognitive detail that can be acted upon.
Now,
so that's how I would connect them.
Now there, I think of, it was a throwaway comment from Greer where he noted that some of these extraterrestrials have IQs of 450. Now I assume this is on the Sarah-Binet scale, where 100 is an average, 140 is the 98th percentile, and by that measure your sort of highest ever human IQs are 190, 200. So he makes reference to this number of 450, and I give him the benefit of the doubt, and I assume this is the product of some study done. Now, if that is then the case, can you speculate as to how language would evolve, or how language would be different for them, quote unquote, if they do have a radically more powerful intellect? I mean, do you have a sense of what that would start to look like?
Well, let me ask you, what do you think? I mean, how would you answer that question?
You have to come back to what is the question? What is intelligence? What's cognition? And if it's an ability to simply perceive relevant variables at hand and understand the relationship between them, then a more powerful intelligence sees more variables and sees more relationships. that exist. So, you know, that's how we just understand it in the everyday sense. You know, such and such is, you know, such and such a person is intelligent. They see things, they understand things. So if you're dealing with something where, you know, if you have a vast and more powerful intelligence, then I would imagine that the world is experienced in a way which is much more, if you like, interconnected than ours. And again, you know, now that I speak of it and you've asked me, I have to speak of a personal experience I had with possibly extraterrestrials. And it comes back to, I know I've mentioned this before, where a friend and I had conducted an experiment to try and vector in extraterrestrial craft. And we persisted this for days, and disappointingly, no response. And we say disappointingly because we worked on the premise that surely these efforts are detected, and that surely you think there'd be someone who would just think, you know, hey, fuck it, let's just whiz by these guys and just make their day. But what happened was my now ex-wife did see lying in the park 2 craft parked in the sky for over 2 hours. And I think almost 2 hours rather. And when she told me this, and I called my friend who's very keen interest in astronomy, and just by the details at hand, logically we were able to rule out some of the more obvious possibilities. And for a moment, I was overwhelmed by, and it was momentarily overwhelmed by their thinking, quote unquote. I just had it, and again, I must stress this is most momentarily, had a sense of being able to see much more deeply than we do. And that their actions naturally and obviously predicated upon this far more expansive and penetrating vision, which in itself is the cognitive property of IQ we're trying to speak.
Well, I think there's a lot to what you say. Now, if you talk about intelligence generally, I think that on the one hand, you can compare intelligence, and on the other hand, you can't. This is something that comes from the nature of intelligence. Each mind is a kind of universe unto itself. So in one sense, you simply can't compare intelligence because intelligence is a property of mind, and minds are, in one sense, always completely different. On the other hand, you can compare. So taking what you just said and what we're talking about, suppose that human communication, as I've been describing it, for what that's worth, and this carrot-style communication, provided it exists, or even it doesn't, in the thought experiment, let's suppose that these 2 points exist on a line. What does that line look like? If we suppose that they exist on a line, in what direction did the lines, each end of the line go? Well, thinking of the most primitive type of communication is easy because we can do that just using examples on Earth. If you go backwards from human communication, what are some more primitive types of communication? Well, for example, the cry. If a baby cries, or if an animal or a human wounded in the forest cries and screams, a cry, a scream, is the most basic kind of communication. What is that? In a way, it conveys no linguistic meaning. And in a way, you could say that it doesn't even exist in a linguistic context, in a very qualified sense. Because what ends up happening is you, in a sense, have a very raw transmission of one physical state to another. Now, if we suppose that mothers, right after birth, are hardwired, quote unquote, I dislike that term, but let's say something very, very fundamental that culture does not touch. If mothers are hardwired to respond physically to a crying baby in some way, either the mammary glands start producing or they're compelled to move physically to the baby, whatever the physical response is, if it's like an automatism, then we would say that that is the most primitive type of communication, because we have one body physically producing a result in another with nothing else happening. And as you work your way up the spectrum, more and more is conveyed, more and more is achieved through the exercise of communication. We might even say that on one level, a baby's cry causes a mother to produce milk, but that by itself doesn't even require the mother to feel anything about the baby hearing the cry. Maybe, however, it does. So the next step up, we might say, well, not only is there a physical production of milk triggered, but the mother is awash in a particular kind of emotion, care, concern, whatever it is, alarm. You can begin to see kind of what happens as we walk up the steps. We go from an automatic physical response to maybe a physical response accompanied by feeling, to maybe a feeling independent of a physical response. So, for example, if you hear music or whistling or a sound in the distance or something, maybe that creates an emotional effect, but doesn't call for any particular biospecific response, behavioral response. But then you keep going up the ladder. Now we have sounds that are able to differentiate from each other. They're no longer just a cry, which is a raw emotion passed between one body in space to another. Now we have a cry, in a sense, that becomes differentiated into a structured system of discrete elements. Maybe one cry means this, another cry means that. One cry is a cry for help, another cry is a cry of laughter, another cry is a cry of sorrow. We don't know. Maybe at this level of primitive cognition, we can't even reflect on this cognitively. We don't have words to assign to it, but nevertheless, what we experience and how we behave in relation to these different cries attests to our recognizing there's a difference. So you keep going. With added linguistic complexity, perhaps different sound speech patterns can become associated in a lingering way with objects in the physical world. One type of cry or grunt comes to represent this particular thing. Maybe it's something in the sky, the moon. Maybe it's a tree that's been standing out there for as long as we've been alive, and we keep running up to it and screaming at it, and it doesn't do anything. We think it's an animal, it won't back away. So we always have this one particular scream or challenge that we offer to this damn tree that's out there. Well, it keeps building complexity. The more linguistic elements that can be used, the more complex a system, the more you can overlay it onto your environment, so that now we've got words for things in the physical world. And thanks to the fact we have these worlds, our cognitive machinery is able to devote attention to those things, and the fact we're able to devote attention to them perhaps causes our cognitive machinery to notice other things, which maybe there's a different cry or grunt one day waiting for. So now we start using it. And because others are in the same boat as us, in the same primitive system, they are able to catch on because they're using the same linguistic system as us, however primitive. It keeps going and going and going until eventually we've got whole languages, discourses devoted to all sorts of different domains of life. Our inner world, the outer world, the simple fact that we can distinguish between the two is a linguistic innovation. You name it. The discourses of today, with their complexity, are totally different than the discourses of 2,000 years ago. Literary theory is bullshit, but you look at the studies they've done of the history of the novel. The very fact that you could tell a story from a first-person point of view is a kind of development. The fact that you can, all of these linguistic innovations that go into storytelling, they are very clearly discernible over the passage of time, and a lot of them are recent. So we always take for granted today that what we're dealing with is an existent totality of language and linguistic tools and modes of expression, but these things have to appear, and before they appear, they don't exist. So anyway, I mean, we've gotten to the point where today, if you give somebody a word, we have a kind of weird set of competing cognitive areas associating with the word. You know, the stimulus in this cognitive domain is there. The stimulus in another cognitive domain is there. What we experience is a kind of, it's an unclear but nevertheless obviously felt moment of experience. And what happens though if we continue ahead of where we are today? This is what I'm getting at. Because you can put that carrot scenario on this line and draw a straight line between them. And you can also incorporate it with all the other anecdotes of communication in alien encounters. You have a situation in these alien encounters where it seems pretty universal that they don't talk to each other. They communicate telepathically.
Sorry, I missed that. You said it seems
pretty universal that extraterrestrials, in the vast majority of these accounts, do not speak to each other.
Sure. Okay.
They communicate. They'll communicate telepathically, and they might even point their eyes at each other to do so, depending on the story. And they'll communicate telepathically to a human being. And sometimes there is linguistic communication, and it's unclear to the person experiencing it whether it's from a mouth, from a mechanical recording of audio, whether it's a projection into the mind. So it seems safe to say that their mode of communication is not primarily linguistic. All of these accounts say it's telepathic. Well, then what is the purpose of the writing? Well, one could reasonably say that probably the writing is there for when another alien's not present. Like if I'm able to get my information telepathically by looking at the eyes, into the eyes of another fellow being, that's great. But say I have to run up to this flying saucer in a hurry, get in and operate it. In an emergency or something, nobody else is around. Well, wouldn't it be great if I have some characters, visual characters, which, owing to the way our minds are at the present moment, the way we've evolved with communication over the course of our history, conveys an ungodly amount of detail, which I'm able to grasp quite organically, telling me everything I need to know.
Well, you know, this makes me think again, just to shoot off on a tangent, but there was, to me, a very, very credible case reported by Linda Moulton Howe, where she speaks about her interview of an agent of some organization involved with contact with the Greys. And he has a meeting, and in the course of that meeting, he reports that he had a mind-to-mind connection with the Grey, where his questions, even before they were formulated, were answered by the appearance of imagery, like a movie stream in his mind. And what he reported was that this was not happening. There were I think it was 9 movies were being shown. This is his wording, being shown sort of simultaneously as he's having experience and questions arise. But he also reports, my memory has this right, is that above these movies there was some sort of symbol, some sort of letter present. There was some sort of symbolic interface between in their communication, and I wonder, I guess, is there some sort of archetypal language that governs and informs what are the devolved linguistic structures we have that we experience?
Well, perhaps there is in a sense. The sense, though, might simply be that communication itself is always the result of one mind trying to communicate to another. And to the extent that all language, all communication is that may be the archetype. That may be the common element. I suspect that there is no limit to the types of communication out there. On the one hand, the linguistic combination, just because of the fact that we're in a 3 to 4 dimensional physical reality of combination. The systems that can exist, you might as well say, are effectively infinite. Because even in a system with a finite number of elements, once you reach a certain number of elements, the number of possible combinations of those elements heads toward infinity very quickly. I don't think it even takes that many elements. And then when you consider comparatively system versus system, one system with one type of element and another system with another type of element, when these elements have bases in physiology, the physiology of totally different species evolved on totally different planets with totally different environments, there's no limit to it. I don't see that there's any limit. And given that there's no limit, therefore, there's an infinite number of differences between them. And therefore, I wouldn't say that there's a kind of Platonic archetypal language in the sense of one original language, to rule them all. However, you could probably say that simply to the extent that language is meant to communicate, when there's a language, you can always observe certain similarities. You're also going to have a shifting ratio between the mental sensory content and the linguistic element. In other words, if these extraterrestrials in the carrot scenario are able to look at a symbol or a series of symbols and obtain from that what we would consider a massive amount of precise, distinguishable details, systems of information, whereas we don't with ours, that's a different ratio of quote-unquote content to linguistic unit. And you might try as an experiment to imagine what communication would be like for species, beings more evolved than they. Obviously, they still need, let's say, 30 symbols on the side of the craft in order to understand how to operate it. Well, there might be a different group out there even more evolved. So the possibilities are limitless, it seems to me.